We won't actually choose our new president for over a year, but we are already in the midst of an aggressive campaign season. And while there are 20, count them, 20 announced candidates to choose from, many people who I've talked to are not very excited about any of them. I got an email this week from a friend who follows politics very closely, and he too feels like throwing up his hands. His cynicism was reflected in a small collection of quotations that he sent along with the email. The sources range from Aesop, that ancient teller of fables, to, well, Jay Leno. And all of the quotations have one thing in common: frustration. Here are a few. Centuries ago, the creator of the fable of the tortoise and the hare wrote, "We hang petty thieves and appoint the great ones to public office." While in more recent times, lawyer Clarence Darrow wrote, "When I was a boy, I was told anybody could become president. I'm beginning to believe it." Apparently, it's an international issue because Charles de Gaulle once said, "I have come to the conclusion that politics is too serious a matter to be left to politicians." And then there's Jay Leno, a frequent tongue-in-cheek commentator on political matters. The former Tonight Show host once observed, "If God wanted us to vote, he would have given us candidates." Jesus never voted. And he, aside from a remark about paying taxes, never made direct comments, at least not any that we have record of, about first-century Roman politics. But he did have some very definite ideas about leadership in general and leadership in specific. And those ideas are well summarized and well captured in our reading from Mark. It begins with a reiteration of a warning Jesus has given his disciples twice before in Mark, this oldest of the Gospels. 2 times he has already told them what this reading begins with. "We're going to Jerusalem, boys, and it's not going to go very well. The authorities are not going to appreciate what I have to say, nor will they like what I'm going to do. I'll be arrested. I'll be tried. I'll be found guilty of some trumped-up charges. And then, boys, I'm going to be hung out to dry. They're going to execute me. Yes, I'll be raised from the dead when it's all over, but until then, it's not a pretty picture." He repeats this so often in Mark that it becomes sort of his stump speech. But the disciples only hear what they want to hear. We're going to Jerusalem. That must mean he's about to make his move. He's going to announce his candidacy. Jesus for king. 2 of the disciples, James and John, they signed on to the campaign early. They were with Jesus since before the New Hampshire primaries. They spent time with him in the cornfields of Iowa. They've licked envelopes and put up posters and given a big chunk of their lives, 3 long years, to support this Jesus movement. And now they feel they are well positioned to reap the benefits of their work. So making sure that they get their bids in first, they sidle up to Jesus with a request. When you make it big, Jesus, when you come into power, grant us to sit, they say, one at your right hand and one at your left. Make me vice president, says one of them, and my brother here the Secretary of State. Not again, thinks poor Jesus. Not again. I keep trying to be straight with these guys, but they just don't understand. Fellas, listen closely. Can you really handle what's coming down the pike? They nod their heads. So he tries another tactic. He's good with metaphors, so he uses two. Can you drink from the cup that I'm about to drink from now? Can you be baptized with the baptism that awaits me in the capital city? He, of course, doesn't mean a literal cup. He's not talking about an actual baptism. He's talking about self-sacrifice. He's talking about his own death. But still, they don't get it. Sign us up. We can do it. Well, okay, then, he says, you will drink from the cup. You'll be baptized. But I can't promise you positions in the cabinet. That's not mine to decide. The other disciples overhear this conversation, and they think James and John are playing games, trying to manipulate Jesus. And they're ticked off. Not that they understand any better than these two sons of Zebedee, but they'll be darned if those two fishermen get any better positions than we do. One can only imagine the level of frustration that Jesus must be feeling at this point. After all, he's had these 12 guys with him for 3 years. They've heard him preach hundreds of times. They've heard all his stories. They've seen the healings and the miracles. 3 years. You'd think they would have understood him by now. But they don't. Fellas, listen, he says. Listen. I know when it's politics as usual, there's lots of pushing and shoving for the best place in line. And I know rulers tend to really take advantage of their positions. But that's not how it works with me, guys. If you really want to be the top dog, if you want to be the head honcho, you've got to be willing to take the bottom rung on the ladder. In fact, boys, you've got to be willing to hold the ladder for others so that they can climb it. Whoever wishes to become great among you, he says, must be your servant. I'm not here to be waited on, he says. I'm not here to be served. I'm here to serve others. And fellas, if you're going to follow me, you've got to do the same. Imagine if that were the attitude of all those in positions of power. They would be true public servants. How transformative for society it would be if that were the norm and not the exception. That said, this teaching isn't offered up simply for governmental officials. Indeed, it is for all persons in leadership positions. For the good leader is not in it for him or herself. The good leader understands that she or he is in their position in order to be of service to those they lead. Pope Francis seems to understand that, which explains in part his great popularity with so many. Being driven around in a tiny little Fiat instead of a stretch limo on his recent visit to America wasn't just about image. It was and is a true reflection of his belief that as Pope, he is to be a servant of the people, a servant of his church, a servant of God. So where does that leave us when we might be frustrated with leadership? Especially in a democracy such as ours, where we have the right to choose our own leadership. Should we just wallow in despair? That's the way it goes. The 18th century French philosopher Joseph de Maistre once said, "Every country has the government it deserves." Should we just accept that rather forlorn idea and lower our expectations? Or should we raise our standards and employ the standard Jesus models as we look for leaders who will put the needs of others ahead of their own? Indeed, will we take it one step further and look for leaders who will help us put the needs of others ahead of our own? Instead of asking, "What will you do for me?" will we be courageous enough to ask our potential leaders how they can help us address the needs of the poor? How can they help us deal with the rampant problem of mental illness in this country? How will they help us deal with the violence that keeps bursting on the scene, even as it did last night in Fort Myers, where 5 were shot, 1 killed at ZombieCon? Will we have the courage to ask, what can you do to help us meet the needs of the marginalized? Will we have the courage as a nation to look for public servants who will be just that? Or will we settle for business as usual? And how about other arenas as well? How about the church, for instance? Do we become so focused on having our own needs met that we forget we as a congregation are called to be a people who place the needs of the poor and the marginalized ahead of our own? Do we expect our leaders, our pastors, our lay leaders, our staff to devote all their time to making us comfortable, to making us feel good, to giving us a sense of peace? Or do we recognize that part of the job of our church leaders is to challenge us to think about the poor and the disadvantaged? Do we remember as a congregation that we are called to be servants and that our leaders are called to be servants of the servants? Yes, they. Well, let's drop this third person stuff. We, your pastors, your staff, your lay leaders like Pam and Don, we are here to help address your needs, but in such a way as to empower you to go out into the world and address the needs of others, those whom Jesus called the least among our brothers and sisters. Friends, this has nothing to do with political parties or particular candidates. It has nothing to do with religious denominations or a particular belief system. Servant leaders can and do come in all shapes and sizes and philosophical stripes, but their common characteristic is their willingness to put others ahead of self. But there is a caveat. In a democracy such as ours, in a denomination like our own, the effectiveness of servant leaders is totally dependent on having a servant community to lead. And so, while we must ask these questions of our leaders, ultimately, all of us need to ask the very same thing of ourselves. Has God placed me here on this earth to be served? Or has the Holy One placed me here to serve others? What would Jesus say? What did Jesus do? Amen. Sisters and brothers, many consider the highest and most honored lay position in the church to be that of deacon. And it is certainly an extremely important role in the congregation. But do you know why deacons serve you communion? It's a reminder of the fact that the very first deacons were called in the church to be waiters, literally. They made sure that at public meals, when the church gathered and shared its food, the widows got their fair share. Every Sunday, when Deb and I are robed, we both wear this piece of liturgical garb, this vestment. Occasionally someone will say to me, "Gee, that's a lovely scarf you are wearing." It's not a scarf. It could keep my neck warm, I suppose, if this were up north. It's what's called a stole, S-T-O-L-E. It may, ironically, have originally come from some Roman official garb. But in the story and the history of the church, it's come to represent something quite different. It's come to represent the towel that Jesus more than likely had around his neck as he acted as the lowest of the lowest servants and washed the feet of his disciples. Your leaders are called to be servants, whether they're lay or clergy. But they are called to be servants to servants. They are called to make it possible for you to go into the world and help to meet the many needs of the poor, the marginalized, those who are in despair. The choice is yours. Pomp and ceremony or service. it's pretty clear which side Jesus comes down on. Go in peace, knowing that the God of Jesus is with you and will give you the courage you need to do the right thing. Amen.